As we prepare to deal with the fallout from the recently completed debt ceiling debate, I'd like to preview my comments on that situation and what we ended up with by considering some ideas that we've been uh, tossing around in the context of education and political discourse, political commentary, etc. As recently there's been a lot of talk about how many of the younger generation are now seeing socialism as a viable option as opposed to capitalism. Particularly many theorists and philosophers and commentators on the left and far left view capitalism as part of the problem within America. And so I'd like to comment. Uh, Again, I'm not an economist, as it says there. I'd like to comment on what I understand, based on just thoughts and looking at a few sources, trying to understand capitalism, Marxism, socialism, or what, communism being the next step in the chain, as we'll talk about in just a second. But just trying to wrap my mind around some of the basic ideas on the table, what some of the problems are, in addressing these ideas and approaching this discussion and put forth some solutions. So, starting with some definitions, and these are all from dictionary.com. I just Googled them today on dictionary.com to see what the first definition for each term would be. And first is capitalism, an economic system in which investment in and ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange of wealth is made and maintained chiefly by private individuals or corporations, especially as contrasted to cooperatively or state-owned means of wealth. And one of the things I touch on in a couple other places, and we'll touch on again going forward, is I think one of our problems is the heavy influence of corporations, the stock exchanges, etc., where ownership is moved further and further away from the actual production of the materials in question. But we'll get into that more later. Marxism, the system of economic and political thought developed by Karl Marx, along with Friedrich Engels, especially the doctrine that the state throughout history has been a device for the exploitation of the masses by a dominant class, that class struggle has been the main agency of historical change, and that the capitalist system, containing from the first the seeds of its own decay, will inevitably, after the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, be superseded by a socialist order and a classless society. Marxism is kind of an overarching term that addresses developments that we'll talk about, socialism and communism. And the whole idea of Marx is that capitalism is the source of many, if not all, of society's woes and the woes of individuals within society. Socialism, a theory or system of social organization that advocates the ownership and control of the means of production, distribution, capital, land, etc., by the community as a whole, usually through a centralized government. Socialism can take place at different levels of organization, and that's one of the themes that I address throughout my commentary on society and particularly economics ideas, and just the whole way we choose to organize ourselves, namely, at what level of social organization are you talking about, from the individual on up through the state. But here, the idea in socialism is that there is control of at least certain parts of those aspects of material wealth and wealth generation that are shared by the community as a whole, and other parts may in fact be controlled by private citizens or corporations or some combination thereof. Communism, theory or system of social organization based on the holding of all property in common, actual ownership being ascribed to the community as a whole or to the state. And so here you essentially are focused on a situation where the state controls all of the resources necessary for providing for the economic needs of the people. And the whole Marxist system ultimately sees socialism as a necessary step to communism, with communism being the ideal organization in which society, according to communist ideas, ought to be, according to Marx ideas, ought to be organized. And then the last thing to note here, free market, an economic system in which prices and wages are determined by unrestricted competition between businesses without government regulation or fear of monopolies. And so free market capitalism is the ideal framing of the American economic system. But as we'll talk about over the next few minutes, we've strayed pretty far from that. The degree to which it ever actually existed is a different debate, but that it doesn't exist today, I will argue, is a given. So, what about this whole thing? There's one aspect in all this discussion that I think uh, is one of the deciding factors or key factors to consider when we talk about Marxist theory and capitalist theory and the different theories, the different understandings with respect to how society ought to be organized. And that is the place of the individual. And there are two aspects of the individual and the place of the individual vis-a-vis society that I want to consider. One, in Marxism and related theories, the individual is a product of and fundamentally defined by the society and economic conditions into which the individual has been born. Marx classically breaks all of history or interprets all of history as a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeois and the proletariat. And through that lens, Marx interprets all of history and all other aspects of society, religion, etc., etc. And the idea is that the social group, the community, is primary, and it's in the context of community that individual identity is realized. In capitalism, the individual is primary, recognized as the center of his or her own focus, and free to act in his or her own interest, insofar as his or her actions do not violate the rights of others. So in capitalism, it's the individual that is central in trying to understand what is best for the community as a whole. You start with the individual, and part of the argument behind capitalism is as individuals pursue their own interest, everybody has a chance to ultimately benefit from that. But there's another aspect to this view of the individual that I think is even more central to understanding the division between Marxism and capitalism with respect to how the theories themselves are formulated or understood or applied. In Marxism and related theories, the assumption is that in well ordered society, individual goodness will prevail so that everyone works to the benefit of all with no need for a governing authority, except in the interim while transitioning from capitalism to communism. So, again, the idea in Marxism is that fundamentally human beings are good, are egalitarian, and will in fact work to the benefit of everybody, from each as he is able to each as he has need, so that everybody can realize an equally good life experience. But the assumption is that it's bad societies, the the rich, the proletariat, having captured the means of production, the means of wealth, the capital of the world, are thereby lording it over those who are working and only have labor to offer, and are taking advantage of those who are laboring and not getting a fair shake with respect to realizing the benefit of the labor that they're doing. But the idea is that because of human beings' inherent goodness, we simply need to get the right social structure, the right context for individual goodness to blossom. In capitalism, however, it's the self-centered nature of individuals that's seen as the motivation for productive work, which benefits the individual to the residual benefit of all, hence the need for laws which protect against treating individuals as means rather than as ends. So in capitalism, there's no assumption that the individual is inherently good. In fact, the capitalism, to a degree, doesn't even worry, as a strictly economic theory, about whether or not humans are by nature good or not good. Good and evil is not the issue. Capitalism is, in essence, recognizing that human beings, rightly or wrongly, tend to work for their own self interest. And capitalism seeks to take advantage of that, so to speak, to structure the economy in such a way that as individuals pursue their own self interest, they will realize the benefits of their efforts, and others will benefit from their efforts as well as they each pursue their own self interest. But it doesn't presume that we simply need to get society properly structured in order for an inherent goodness in human beings to prevail so that everybody will do what he or she is able to the benefit of everybody else. But it may, in fact, fail to recognize and properly um, moderate itself or properly address the circumstances in which individuals exceed their self interest or their motivation to act in a self interested way to the detriment of everybody, as opposed to directing their self interest in a way that ultimately benefits everybody. So, some of the pros and cons of these approaches. In circumstances where resources are finite or very limited, Marxism and related theories may result in a more equitable distribution of supply relative to need, and is likely to be invoked anyway in extreme circumstances, for example, war and famine. For example, in war, during World War II, when there was rationing of materials, metal and sugar and other materials, as the United States was on a war footing and all the resources were directed to achieving victory in the war, folks back home in the States were allotted tickets as family groups, etc., in order to maintain control over the resources so that the war machine could be fed and victory could be realized on the battlefield rather than allowing the United States and the rest of the free world to be subject to the Nazi threat. In the family environment, the family traditionally understood is structured in such a way that the mom and the dad are working to provide from whatever roles they're going to adopt as they develop the family, but they'll work to provide for each other and then for the children when it's going to be a long time before the children are going to be able to contribute anything in a material sense to the well being of the family. So, in those kinds of situations where resources are finite or limited, or an obligation is placed upon the producers to care for those who are unable to produce themselves. And today, more than perhaps any time in history, we have the not only children that are being cared for by parents, but children in the Middle Ages and into their own senior age are providing care for their senior adult parents. But there are limited resources that need to be allocated um, based on need. But for the most part, capitalism is going to say, those situations are rare. Capitalism opens the door to an increase in both the variety of goods and services and the efficient production of goods and services, particularly in a free market with only the necessary protections against exploitative practices, as individuals maximize their productivity in ways which maximize their consumptive power. In other words, as individuals are working to realize their own self interest, they will develop products that people want. They will develop products in an efficient manner when faced with competition so they can maximize the likelihood of a sale and the return on that sale. In other words, as people pursue their own interest, there will be a vested interest on all parties involved to do the most possible in the most efficient manner possible. And that presents a continually growing market. I mean, we just need to stop and think about the things that we use today that we consider impossible to do without that didn't even exist 30, 40, or 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And the degree to which it's the free market capitalist framework under which this advance has taken place. But some of the cons, some of the reasons that I think that Marxists need to reflect on, in addition to what we talked about when we talked about the individual and the view of the individual, but some of the cons with respect to trying to apply Marxist socialist philosophy, some of the cons in the context of capitalist philosophy, economic philosophy. Marxism and related theories may stifle productivity in the name of equalizing the distribution of goods and services as available at any given time. And in particular, this is particularly true and dangerous when conditions threaten the availability of goods and services which are necessary for life. And this is, I think, evidenced in the context of the 5-year plans, where, particularly, for example, in the Soviet Union, when all farming, the centralized planning idea, when people were told how to farm and how they were going to use their land by people who didn't understand farming or land use, and things happened to work out for a good crop the first year, and then subsequent to that, there were millions of people who were lost, who died from starvation when they had some of the richest farmland in the world. But Marxism, again, the degree to which it is able to deal efficiently when there are finite services, does not afford within itself any way to expand the services, the goods that might be available to society as a whole. Capitalism, however, may result in a centralization of power that stifles innovation and efficiency in order to preserve the current power dynamics developing into crony capitalism. So the degree to which capitalism, properly structured, recognizes the inherent selfishness of human beings and their desire to pursue their own interests, if capitalism doesn't take the steps necessary to secure a free market, an environment in which innovation is possible, then capitalism can develop into its own worst enemy, so that the strong, in fact, take over and stifle ultimately innovation and development, even if, relatively speaking, under capitalism you have a better overall circumstance than under Marxism. For example, this is particularly true when economic activity is centered on debt rather than capital, instant gratification rather than delayed gratification, active consumption rather than long-term planning. Some of the things that can threaten the stability of this system. One thing about capitalism is there's going to be failure in capitalism. Nobody wants to fail. Any effort to avoid failing, apart from producing better, more efficient goods and services, is going to result from power being misapplied and short circuiting the whole capitalist system. So, the mixed bag in the world today. Almost all economies in the modern world are a mixed bag on the scale from pure communism to pure capitalism. The US economy in particular has shifted more towards socialism over the last several decades. Also in the US over the last several decades, there has been a centralization of the economy into fewer and fewer businesses, and a centralization of banking power into fewer and fewer banks, and a growing union of government and big business, with both established entities in the federal government and businesses, like the military industrial complex or big pharma, and focusing on one approach to a problem, think electric car technology and big pharma. Again, as the US has adopted many policies that are more socialist in nature, the response of those who are supposed to be upholding the capitalist perspective has actually reflected a response of people who are in power seeking to maintain their power, their position, and control the direction of the economy at large. The degree to which there are fewer business and oligarchies or monopolies are developed, you have a stifling of productivity and development. The degree to which the federal government funds particular approaches to problems, electric car technology, uh, particular medicines, rather than allowing the engine of the capitalist economy to generate and test ideas against each other so that the best idea comes to the top. You have the central planning that is a problem in Marxism and in communism being manifest in what is supposedly a capitalist economy. So, how can we restore balance? How can we find, from the perspective of the United States, a path back to a more pure form of capitalism and an economic framework that allows for better developments? One, break up too big to fail businesses and banks. The degree to which failure is not allowed to take place in capitalism, capitalism is no longer being practiced. Capitalism depends on the best being developed and less than the best failing to keep the ideas flowing with respect to both the goods and services that can be developed to meet the needs of the people. Conduct regular, meaningful audits of captured market industries, military supply, the federal government supported medical research, etc. The degree to which the military and the companies that are associated with the military are generating innovation and technology that only the federal government can support, and then reaping the benefits at the expense of the American people and paying for those benefits, that's a problem. The degree to which, one thing that has come out of the last couple of years, the degree to which big pharma and the federal government, the CDC and NIH and other institutions of the government have this relationship whereby research is funded at the expense of the American public, and then all the profits go to the stakeholders in these private, supposedly private entities. That's a problem. Restructure the tax code to ensure collections on wealth and income from all income and wealth brackets. I think, it's become increasingly clear that there are too many easy to fix loopholes in the tax system that are allowing the um, accrual of wealth in the hands of a relative few, often for the type of work and the type of activity that is not essentially producing any kind of product that is measurable, that adds to the actual value, the overall value of the economy. Establish priorities for the federal government and construct a budget accordingly. I think one of the biggest problems we have is that politicians are no longer able to politic with respect to coming to a consensus on what we ought to be doing and how we can do it. The degree to which, or again, a recent debt ceiling debacle is reflective of everybody wins in politics and those who are supporting the politicians in power and the American people lose, that needs to be addressed, restructured. And then finally, create and require substantive curriculum for basic economic issues at the high school and or undergraduate levels. We need to ensure that the people of America, through their public education system, are being properly educated with respect to economic issues, both something like this discussion, considering the core of the different economic theories that have developed, particularly over the last 200 years, how those have been expressed, how they might be expressed in better ways, et cetera, rather than simply allowing young people to be swayed by claims that sound good but don't actually work out in the real world. Well, let me know what you think about some of the ideas put out here. What other particular ideas we can look at in greater detail, where I've missed the boat and need to make adjustments. Thank you all very much for your time. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.